Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to today's webinar. COVID, and COVID. We know that asymptomatic patients of COVID also can spread the infection. This COVID virus is a very robust virus and remains alive for at least 28 days on surface of plastic, smartphone. So friends, please try to clean it regularly whenever necessary. Encourage your patients not to indulge in festival-related activities because we also know that the mental health impact will last longer. Today is a World Sight Day is celebrated on 10th of October. It is basically coordinated for the prevention of blindness under WHO Vision 2020, the Right to Sight Global Initiative. And we at IMA Mumbai West also have planned, along with Dr. Akhil Contractor and President Rashmi Khan Sangvi, a special program on ophthalmic bonanza. First, a presbyopic intraocular lens by Dr. Vaishal Kenia, red eyes by Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, and diabetes retinopathy by Dr. Vikram Mehta, and eye care in children by Ashni Maniar. One more announcement I would like to make. Those who have placed order for N95 masks, please collect it from IMA Mumbai West office because 15th of October is the last date of implementing this project. Anybody who wants to place order, please place order before 15th of October. Secondly, so I hand over mic to President Dr. Rashmikant Sangvi, who will go on with the proceedings ahead. Dr. Rashmikanji.
Thank you, Dr. Shobha. Friends, welcome to IMA's yet another good CME. We had celebrated World Heart Day, which was a very good, successful program. Today, again, we have a equally good program on World Sight Day. We have a battery of speakers led by Dr. Kenia. I think we should not be wasting more time. I am sure all of you have something more to learn today. I request Dr. Akhil Contractor, our program convener and trustee, who is a senior general practitioner from Santa Cruz, who has been always organizing various programs on the CMEs. I hand over the mic to Dr. Akhil Contractor to carry forward the program.
Good afternoon, friends. Today is a great day that way that Dr. Vaishal Kenia, who is supporting this activity on ophthalmology from last few years, and he again only on one phone call agreed to do this program completely. Dr. Vaishal Kenia is the chairman and managing director of the Kenia Eye Hospital, Santa Cruz West. He is a cataract, corneal and refractive surgeon, and he specialized in cataract, cornea and glaucoma surgery. He was trained under world-renowned Professor Cox in Bonn, Germany, and he assisted Dr. Cox in surgeries of advanced phacoemulsification, refractive surgery, that is LASIK, phaco in pediatric cataract and subluxated cataracts. Dr. Kenia was awarded the Accomplished Young Ophthalmologist 2017 award at the Star Evo ICL award function at Lisbon, Portugal on 5th of October 2017. From last 3 years, that is 2018, 19 and 2020, his videos are accepted by the International Ophthalmic Conference Committee. I think that's a great achievement, Doctor. Today, we'll be talking on a topic of intraocular lens. And before he starts, to be on the lighter side with one joke I had told, I think 2 years back for his meeting only, that one lady filed a suit against Dr. Vaishal Kenia. And her argument was that my husband has lost complete interest in me after the cataract surgery you have done. Vaisal Kenia went to the court. He told the judge, sir, I have not done anything. I have only improved his eyesight. So we welcome Dr. Vaisal Kenia again. And sir, you take over.
Thank you so much. I thank IMA Mumbai West Branch for giving me this opportunity. I thank Dr. Akhil sir, Dr. Rashmikant sir, and Dr. Shobha ma'am for giving us this opportunity. Today, the concept of the ophthalmic CME is to give you an overview and update on different topics, what is happening. The commonest topic which I thought is cataract. Though cataract is so common that still a lot of things are occurring in this cataract sphere. So we'll be talking about the presbyopic cataract surgery with presbyopic intraocular lens. The epoch of cataract surgery. Cataract surgery involves loss of accommodation. Innovation in cataract surgery has aimed to restore not only vision but loss of accommodation. Intraocular designs have aimed to restore this accommodation with multifocal lens, accommodative lens. But these multifocal IOLs or accommodative IOLs have not been able to restore what the natural accommodation of the eye is. And now EDOF IOLs have come in. Now these EDOF IOLs are slightly more like the natural vision, and we are going to talk today more about these EDOF IOLs. To achieve the ultimate vision goal, the cataract surgery has to evolve not only in the intraocular lenses, but it has to deliver a consistent, safe, reproducible, and an accurate visual results. So if we see the journey of cataract surgery, the cataract surgery has improved from an intracapsular cataract surgery, which with a Fawn Graphis knife was made, which was sutureless. Then came extracapsular cataract surgery, where around 12 millimeters of incision was put, a corneoscleral incision, and 4 or 5 sutures were taken. Small incision manual cataract surgery was done. Phacoemulsification, microphacoemulsification, femto laser assisted cataract surgery, and the latest is the image guided cataract surgery. Now all these innovations which have evolved is to make the cataract surgery more predictable. Even the cataract surgery anesthesia evolved to make it less painful and more comfortable to the patient, and the recovery to be instantaneous. No injections, no iPad, no black glasses, instant visual recovery with just eye drop anesthesia. The facial retrobulbar blocks were given, peribulbar blocks, subtenons anesthesia, and now we have just eye drop anesthesia for cataract surgery. Intraocular lenses. The first intraocular lens was implanted by Sir Harold Ridley in 1950, and then incidentally it was in a medical student who had got an injury in his eye, and for a traumatic cataract the lens had to be implanted. There were first PMMA rigid lenses which had come in, then flexible anterior chamber lenses had come in, and we know the famous Daljit Singh lens, which is an iris claw lens, which is a posterior chamber, but he used to put it in the anterior chamber. Foldable lenses, then rollable lenses came in, and now even the cylindrical power can be incorporated in the intraocular lens. So a toric lens has come in, and lenses have been monofocal, bifocal, trifocal, and now these lenses which are foldable, toric, now they are also EDOF lenses. Materials have been varied, as I told you. Rigid intraocular lenses, then foldable intraocular lenses had come in. So this cataract surgery is not just evolved in one dimension. It has evolved not only in technology but anesthesia, intraocular lenses. But after evolving so much, the last thing which was required was eye measurements which were taken of the eye, the same thing, precise eye measurements to be taken, and precisely the same thing which is executed inside the eye. That was most important. So tools were developed for precise eye measurements, and one of the first tool, which is an optical biometer.
साउंड जरा कम છે જો
संभळाय છે?
थोड़ा कम नहीं साउंड नहीं आ रहा है
Sorry sir,
साउंड इज लेस
sound is less. Okay, one second. One second, I'll adjust the sound. Now,
नो नॉट मच
so this is how, with the optical biometer, without touching the eye, we are able to take the eye measurements in the natural shape of the eye. So this has been a major leap, and most of the intraocular lens power calculations have been eliminated by doing an optical biometer. So in the same thing, whatever is measured has to be executed intraoperatively. So came the image guided system, which is a Virion. So with these innovations of IO optical biometers, Virion assisted cataract surgery, precision improved, predictable results were reproducible, results are possible, and good quality vision was possible. Now, the final frontier to be conquered was an ability to give the patient post-cataract surgery good quality vision for all distances, maybe for distance, for intermediate distance, and for near. So the trifocal multifocal lenses were able to do so, but they had a lot of glare and halos at night. Patient had to get adjusted or adapted for halos and glare. So this was a disadvantage of these multifocal lenses. And the contrast sensitivity and the quality of vision in low light was also poor. Though they were able to give good vision for distance, intermediate and near, the trifocal lenses, but it had the compromise of glare and halos at night. EDOF lenses came in, extended depth of focus lenses. These lenses had the advantage of less glare and halos in the first generation of lenses. EDOF lenses over a period of time evolved, and the first generation, second generation, and the third generation. Today we have the third generation of EDOF lenses, which we are going to talk about, which do not have any glare and halos at night. They can see, the patient can see at all distances, and with the precision of technology, accuracy of measurement, we are able to give a very safe, predictable result to the patients. So this was the EDOF lenses. There are an array of EDOF lenses available. The first generation of EDOF lenses were able to see only for distance and intermediate. The near vision was not that good, but the pseudo non-diffractive beam EDOF lens was able to see not only for distance, intermediate and near, and this became the first lens which could see without, the patient could see without glare and halos for all distances. So with the present generation, these are the new presbyopic IOLs, which are able to deliver not only good quality of vision, the contrast sensitivity is much better than, far better than the multifocal lenses. So this, I introduced, this is a Lucidis and extended depth of focus IOL. This is a refractive aspheric lens. This is just like a normal hydrophilic acrylic lens, just like a monofocal lens, but it has got a technology of extended depth of focus. And this is a Swiss-made technology. Now, what does an extended depth of focus do? The extended depth of focus, these lenses, they stretch the point focus. The focus of light which falls on the retina is stretched such that by stretching the focus, it covers not only the distance, intermediate and the near foci. So the patient is able to see for all distances and without much compromise in the contrast sensitivity. So with the patented technology of pseudo non-diffractive beam technology, this particular EDOF lens is able to see for all distances. The contrast sensitivity is nothing but the quality of light. Now with this Lucidis lens, it is almost the same like a monofocal lens. So there is no change. If the patient were to ask me what is advantages between a monofocal and a EDOF lens, I would say definitely the EDOF lens scores over, and it gives you an advantage to an ability to see not only for distance but also for. Hello. Can you hear me? Sir, can you hear me?
We can't hear you. No, yeah. Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Share your screen.
Yeah, I'll share. Okay, okay.
Technical problem आ जाता है. Share the screen again.
Yeah. Sorry about the glitch. Yeah, now you can see.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Okay. So this particular lenses, presbyopic lenses, are advantages much better than the diffractive multifocal, the trifocals or the bifocals, which were more common. But in times to come, now this will become the standard where people will not put implant lenses which have got rings on the surface of the intraocular lens. Now this particular lens doesn't have any rings on the surface, so the patient does not have any nighttime glare or halos. The light distribution of this lens is also very good. So even in mesopic, photopic or photopic conditions, the vision is very good, unlike the multifocal lenses where the nighttime vision was poorer. So our experience of Lucidis in extended depth of focal lenses, we did a study and we have published this study now. There's a sample of 34 eyes which we did. A comprehensive preoperative assessment was done. Again, the planning was done with IOL Master 700, and all these cataract surgeries were done with a Virion image guided system. The surgical planning was done and executed. So all surgeries were done by me by phacoemulsification. Patients were examined in 12 hours time, and this was the post-op drug regime where steroid eye drops were given for around 6 weeks. The outcome of this study was that 80% of the patients were 83% of were 6/6 for distance, and around 16% was 6/9. Intermediate vision was very good in around 72% patients. Near vision again in 83% patients was N6, means this is unaided vision without any aid. So Lucidis IOL in majority of these patients give an excellent visual quality for all distances, and whichever a very small residual around 15% patients had a 6/9 uncorrected vision but were corrected with a plus or minus 0.5 diopters. So in all, these lenses has got no glare and halos. Nighttime vision is very good. Computer reading, mobile reading is very good. And if you see the defocus curve is also very good for this lens. And there is a binocular summating effect, meaning with uniocular vision, the binocular vision is still far better. Means a patient who is 6/6 uniocularly, maybe 6/5 binocular. So to summarize this extended depth of focus lens, this is a video which shows this new generation toric extended depth of focus lens, which for the first time we implanted in India at Kenya Eye Hospital. Now this is a Virion assisted surgery where you can see the overlay on the eye. This is a Lucidis lens. It doesn't have any rings on the surface of the lens. Just this is a toric lens which is aligned at 90 degrees. This is the end of the surgery. This was the first implantation in India. Thank you so much. So in times to come, this is the lens, the extended depth of lenses will replace the multifocal lenses for sure. And this is the new age presbyopic IOLs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vaishal. Now I will have to carry you forward from here.
Fine, fine.
You can introduce the second speaker.
Yeah, I'll introduce the second speaker. So I introduce the second speaker, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale. Dr. Nikhil Gokhale is a very prominent corneal surgeon, and he was a past president of Bombay Ophthalmic Association. He's a president of Cornea Society of India. Very down to earth person and very knowledgeable person. And today I have asked Nikhil to speak on a topic which is very, very common for a general practitioner, to speak on red eyes. How do we manage and how do we diagnose red eyes, and what as a family physician we should do? Nikhil, over to you.
Yeah, you'll have to stop screen share and
Yeah, I'll stop my screen share. Yeah, sorry.
can you see my?
Yeah, Nikhil, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So at the outset, I would like to thank Vaishal, and on behalf of IMA, Dr. Sanghvi, Dr. Ahuja, and Dr. Contractor for giving me the opportunity to be here amongst all of you. I think Vaishal's talk was excellent about the latest in the IOL technology and about the new IOLs that are available in the market. I thought I will discuss on the acute red eye as it comes to most of the general practitioners would be seeing patients who have a red eye, and sometimes it's very difficult, I must say, as an ophthalmologist itself, to decide what this red eye is all about. And we get confused when we treat our own patients. So I thought we'd just see some common causes of red eye, and then a little bit about each condition specifically. So when we encounter a patient who has a red eye in the clinic, we can look at a few common questions and situations. For example, if the red eye is associated with active discharge in the eye, so we see a discharge. If the patient's vision is okay, we probably believe it's a red eye with discharge, so must be some sort of a conjunctivitis. If it's mucopurulous, probably a viral or a bacterial conjunctivitis. Whereas if it is mucoid and stringy, or and there is itching, then it could be an allergic conjunctivitis. However, if the patient with active discharge and red eye also says that he cannot see properly, he has severe pain, and sometimes either the patient or we observe a small white spot on the cornea, probably this is a patient who has a corneal ulcer, which is a much more serious situation or problem. And if the patient with the red eye gives a history of injury and he complains that he feels something inside the eye, this may be a corneal aberration, which means like an epithelial defect on the cornea because of injury, or there could be still a foreign body sitting inside the eye which is causing pain and foreign body sensation. And then we have a situation where the patient does not have any discharge and comes with a red eye. In this situation, if the patient does not have any pain, his vision is okay, this could just be a simple subconjunctival hemorrhage. However, if the patient complains of pain, and if you find that the congestion is very localized, that means the eye is red, but only one part of the eye is red, the other part of the eye looks white, it could just be an episcleral inflammation. Most of these patients, the vision is normal. However, if you see redness, which is more around the cornea, and if there is some blurring of vision, the patient may be having inflammation, which we call as iridocyclitis. On the other hand, if you have a patient who has severe pain, if the congestion is in only a part of the eye, this could still be a scleritis. Most patients with scleritis may have vision which may be fairly all right to begin with. And if there is severe pain, there is congestion around the cornea, the vision is very hazy as the patient tells you, and the cornea looks hazy, this could be acute congestive glaucoma. So this is just a little bit of how one could try to figure out what could be the cause of the red eye, or the common causes of red eye that we may see in our clinics in the OPD. What I'll do is I'll just discuss or show you a few slides of the common causes of red eye that we and all of you may be seeing daily in your clinic. The most common is conjunctivitis. We know the patient comes with redness, watering, discharge, burning, itching, and sometimes the lids are swollen. So if it is bacterial conjunctivitis, usually it settles in 3 to 4 5 days. We usually use a broad spectrum antibiotic, ciprofloxacin, ofloxacin. We can use some ointment at night to prevent crusting and dryness. Again, it is important we do not use steroids in an active infection. And a very common problem that we see as ophthalmologists is the use of gentamicin by general physicians. So we would not recommending to use gentamicin because it's quite toxic to the eye surface. And in fact, it can cause a situation where you get active discharge and redness in the lower half of the eye because of use of these drops. And it makes the situation more confusing. So you can have a patient with a lot of discharge, red eye, and then many of these patients may also have lid margin disease. They may have blepharitis, what we call, which harbor bacteria, which tend to make infections more common in some of these patients. The more troublesome form of conjunctivitis is viral, very often adenoviral, which happens as like epidemics. It's very severe. It can cause formation of pseudomembranes, and it can go on for 7 to 15 days, and it can be extremely frustrating for the patient. And sometimes because it's so infectious, once one patient gets it, his entire family gets a red eye and conjunctivitis. Although some may recover quickly, some may take 2 to 4 weeks to recover. Unfortunately, in some patients, once the conjunctivitis starts to recover, they start to get corneal involvement, and they start seeing blurred vision, and they see halos around lights. And this blurred vision may continue for up to 6 months to even a year. And it's again a very disturbing problem in most of these young patients. Since we don't have an antiviral which is effective against the adenovirus, most of the times we try to treat them symptomatically with lubricants, prophylactic antibiotics, and sometimes we use oral non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to give them relief from pain and foreign body sensation. Again, it's essential that we do not use steroids because they will increase the duration of viral shedding and will increase the viral penetration into the ocular tissues. These patients require hygiene, and it's very essential ideally to sort of quarantine them so that they don't spread the infection within the community. And I think we are more aware of these measures with COVID now in place here. But in general, otherwise, these patients continue to move in the society, in our country at least, and that is how the infection continues to spread. And we sometimes start seeing multiple patients every day with severe viral conjunctivitis. So some pictures, you will see red eye, you will see a thick of discharge which is sticking onto the conjunctival surface, which we call as the pseudomembrane. Which can sometimes we try to peel them off with a forceps, and they tend to bleed a little bit, and the inflammation can be extremely severe, as you can see in one of the lower pictures where the eye is hardly opening up. So it can have very variable presentation from a mild red eye to an extremely severe red eye swelling, which can go on for 2 to 4 weeks, and the patient is unable to do his normal duties. The picture on the right side bottom is basically, you can see multiple white dots on the cornea. These are the corneal infiltrates that we say, which sometimes come in patients after the conjunctivitis recovers. And these dots can stay on for 6 to 12 months. They slowly resolve and go away. But as long as they're there, they tend to cause a problem in the quality of vision. And some people find it very difficult to drive at night and to do computer related activities. There is also a specific type of conjunctivitis that we see commonly again in the monsoon period, which is called microsporidial keratoconjunctivitis. Microsporidia are basically organisms that came into limelight after the HIV epidemic, and they commonly cause infections in immunosuppressed patients. They can cause diarrhea, lung infections, and in the eye, they, however, cause infection even in immunocompetent or healthy people. And this conjunctivitis basically comes along with corneal involvement, where we see multiple white dots on the cornea with an acute red eye with discharge. There is no medical treatment available for this particular organism for the eye, and usually we just put antibiotic drops, and it usually in immunocompetent patients, it usually resolves in a period of 7 to 10 days. Microsporidia were initially thought to be prokaryotes or something like protozoa, but now they are being classified into fungal group of organisms. A very question that comes to mind is, does the coronavirus affect the eye, and can they cause conjunctivitis? So conjunctivitis is seen in about 1 to 3% of patients who have COVID. I think anyone who has fever, let it be corona or any other virus, once we have high fever, and we often get a little bit of red eye, but proper conjunctivitis picture is seen in patients who have COVID, which is very severe. Many of them may be in the ICU, and it's observed that patients who have severe redness tend to have a grave outcome. On the other hand, you can also have patients who have inoculated the COVID virus into their eye through maybe fingers or hands which are not clean, or while putting a contact lens without taking adequate hand hygiene, and they can present with conjunctivitis as the first presentation. This COVID virus from the eye through the nasolacrimal duct can also spread into the body and evolve into a proper COVID infection. So as ophthalmologists today, we are often worried when we see conjunctivitis, and often people would ask whether this is COVID or not COVID. And of course, the SARS virus has been identified in the tears and conjunctival samples. This was one publication which showed us the severity of inflammation in a COVID conjunctivitis, and even the cornea was involved with multiple epithelial breakdown on the corneal surface in COVID patients. From conjunctivitis, I would jump to allergy. Allergy is again a very common cause of red eye that patients often come to us with. And the ophthalmic allergies are again second most common form of allergy after nasal and rhinitis. And they really, these patients suffer, and there is a drop in the quality of life or to most patients. When we look at ocular allergy, these pictures show you chemosis. That means it's a ballooning of conjunctiva because of release of fluid. This is an acute allergy which can happen, just like we say there is anaphylaxis. This is an acute event of allergic where there is sudden exposure to a allergen and they get severe chemosis, itching and swelling. Traditionally, allergy has been classified into mild forms of allergy, which are called the seasonal or the perennial allergies, and the more severe forms of allergy, which we call as the vernal keratoconjunctivitis and the atopic keratoconjunctivitis. Traditionally, all allergies will come with a red eye. Itching is a very important symptom. We say if there is no itching, it's no allergy. We also, as I showed you, can get chemosis and a mucus discharge, which is very elastic sort of thing. So we call it like stringy discharge or a very sticky discharge, which can stretch if you try to pull it across. We also get reaction on the conjunctiva and the tarsal plates, which we call as papillae, or if they're large, we call them cobblestones. So the seasonal and the perennial allergies, as I said, often occur in adults who commonly have history of rhinitis. They have red eye, they have itching. There is purely conjunctival involvement, and if the disease is mild, the symptoms may be less or more. This type of allergy usually will not cause any visual loss, and it's because of an IgE mediated typical mechanism and mast cell degranulation. And most patients are well treated with antihistaminics and mast cell stabilizers. On the other hand, we have severe forms of allergy, which we call as the vernal allergy, which happens traditionally or typically in young children, and the atopic allergy, which occurs in young adults. So these are not only IgE mediated, but also mediated through T cells, and therefore it's like an immune response, which is quite severe, involves a type 1 and type 4 hypersensitivity reaction. And this disease, because it's severe, it involves the cornea, can cause visual loss and even total loss of vision, has to be treated with not only antihistaminics and mast cell stabilizers, but we also require immunosuppressive medications locally in the form of steroid drops, cyclosporin drops, and tacrolimus more often we also use. So as I said, the symptoms are basically itching, redness, burning, tearing, associated rhinitis may be there. These features may be seasonal, that means they occur when there is a change of season, change of pollens, or they can occur all 365 days, which we call as perennial, where the allergens may be something that we have inside. For example, the mite, dust mite allergens, which are there all the year round, can cause perennial allergy. On the other hand, the VKC occurs in children predominantly between 4 to 10 years. It's known to be worse in summers. However, we see a lot of children who have year-round severe allergic inflammation. Again, atopic allergy is more common in little older teens and in the 20s, and it's an ongoing condition which is, though rare, can be side-threatening. So just a few pictures on the type of changes that we get. So when you evert the lid, we can get what we call as papillae, which can become large enough to call them cobblestones, which basically rub across the cornea and can cause corneal ulceration as well. The other form, which is common, involves a limbal area where there is a thickening of the limbus around the cornea, and we see yellow dots. These yellow dots are accumulation of eosinophils. We call them as the Horner-Trantas dots. And the limbus gets thickened, and if it is not treated well, it can go on, and the limbus can get destroyed because of severe inflammation as well. On the cornea, we can get corneal ulcers, which we call as shield ulcers, because of severe allergy, which can lead to corneal scarring and which can cause permanent vision loss in some children. The problem that we have currently is that either if we treat them aggressively with steroids, we tend to get into complications of cataract, secondary glaucoma, infections, and that itself can cause loss of vision. On the other hand, if we don't treat them adequately, the tissue damage and the inflammation can also cause vision loss. In our situation, we have problems of inadequate counseling and unrealistic expectations, which make it difficult to treat some of these cases. And we have to use a very organized treatment algorithm, which is based on the concept that as the disease gets severe, we step up our treatment options. And as the disease is severe enough, we will have to use drugs which have more number of side effects. Whenever the disease is chronic, we would like to use steroid sparing agents, which are namely the cyclosporin and the tacrolimus, which do not have side effects like cataract and glaucoma, which is common with steroid using if we use steroids for a long period of time. We also try to use steroids which act more on the surface. So we know that if we use a traditional steroid like betamethasone or dexamethasone or prednisolone, it tends to penetrate, and its effects are seen not only on the surface but also inside the eye, in the anterior chamber, the lens, and so on. Whereas we have some steroids now which are surface acting, which act mainly on the ocular surface, do not penetrate into the anterior chamber and have minimal effect on the lens and the intraocular pressure. So we try to use these more often. And when we have very severe cases which are chronic, we try to do allergy testing and immunotherapy, because that can again help us to reduce the number of medications required in treating these patients. And when we have blinding disease, sometimes we have to resort to surgery and immunosuppression systemically. And before I give allergy, I would just say that sometimes the drops that we use in our patients for glaucoma or for other conditions can also cause allergic dermatitis. And the allergic dermatitis, as you can see, is also something that we do see in our clinics, and especially when patients are using drops on a long-term basis. Corneal ulcer or corneal infection is a sight-threatening emergency where patients come with redness, pain, swelling, discharge. They are very photophobic and there is loss of vision. And in our country, about half our patients are having bacterial infections, another half is having fungal infections. On torchlight, it's very difficult to figure out whether this is bacterial or fungal. So whenever we look at a patient with corneal ulcer, we try to rule out what is the possible cause of this infection. So we need to understand that whenever there is a breakdown of the corneal epithelium, the organisms can enter into the cornea and cause infection. So most commonly, there will be a history of injury, foreign body, use of contact lenses, patients who already have corneal problems, which causes a increase in infections, or surface disorders. Patients who are using steroids for a red eye can get secondary infection. Again, patients who have uncontrolled diabetes, or they are having immunosuppressed, or patients in intensive care units where their eye is exposed or not closed properly, can start getting corneal epithelial breakdown and corneal ulcers. And whenever we see these patients, we have to do a proper evaluation. We start treatment. We have to do microbiology workup to know what infection it is, and so that we can decide. And then in severe cases, we may have to resort to corneal transplant, which is basically a procedure where we remove all infected tissue if it is not responding to medical therapy, or if the cornea perforates, and we replace it with a donor cornea. Which helps us to not only save the eye, but in some patients we are able to save the vision as well if we do it in time and we are successful. Just a word of caution is that because of the increasing use of contact lenses and a decrease in the ability to take care of the lenses, to spend time in cleaning the lenses, we can get serious infections. The most common what we see with contact lens infections is Pseudomonas. And the infection can spread so rapidly that within 24 hours, the whole cornea can get infected and the patient may lose the eye, and can happen bilaterally as well. So a lot of care and caution has to be continued to be maintained when we use contact lenses. Foreign body injuries are very common, and we see these type of linear abrasions on the cornea when we have a patient with a foreign body. Sometimes the foreign body is visible on the cornea, like here with the rust deposits, but sometimes they may be in the conjunctiva and hidden, and we have to evert the lid and remove it. When we talk of injuries, we also see as cornea specialists serious injuries because of chemicals and thermal and industrial injuries, which can cause blindness and which need to be again aggressively managed. As practitioners, I think all of you would see a lot of subconjunctival hemorrhages, patients coming worried suddenly of a red eye. Sometimes the relative sees that the eye has suddenly gone red. There is no pain, the vision is perfectly okay. Very often the patients deny that anything has happened, although when you look at the possible causes of a subconjunctival hemorrhage, it can be injury, it can be vigorous rubbing, can be vigorous coughing or sneezing or vomiting. Patients who have high blood pressure, who are old or who are diabetic, tend to get them more often. And similarly, patients who are on blood thinners, having some hematological disorders, may be again more likely to get it. And it can also happen in certain forms of viral conjunctivitis and ocular tumors. So a lot of causes are there, but frankly, in most cases, we are unable to find a specific cause. It resolves spontaneously and it is left alone. We sometimes give lubricants. Another form of red eye which comes commonly is episcleritis and scleritis. Episcleritis, as the word means, is inflammation of the episclera, which is a thin layer of tissue between the conjunctiva and the sclera, whereas scleritis is the inflammation of the wall of the eye, the white wall of the eye, which we call as sclera. And I must confess that even ophthalmologists are often confused whether they're treating an episcleritis or scleritis. So basically what we see is a red eye, The episcleritis comes as a red eye with minimal pain and discomfort is there. Most patients are comfortable, but they complain of redness, which comes and goes sometimes. And most of these patients can be treated just symptomatically with oral non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, lubricants, and usually it settles down. But then we have some patients who have more severe forms of scleral inflammation, which may be diffuse or which may be nodular or which may cause scleral necrosis and scleral thinning, and which is very serious. Like with any other condition, there is a big list of autoimmune and collagen vascular connective tissue disorders which we need to rule out when we look at scleritis. About 50% of them may not have any condition that can be identified. However, about 40% of them may have an autoimmune disease. Some of them may be already knowing that they have autoimmune disease. Some are diagnosed after they come with scleritis when we do a workup. And some may be negative but develop a systemic disease on follow-up after a few years. And whenever we have a severe scleritis, it indicates there is systemic vasculitis and they need systemic immunosuppression, and eye drops alone are not adequate in treating these patients. So basically, some of these patients will require immunosuppressive therapy in consultation with a rheumatologist to take care of the scleritis. And just to end, we have acute iridocyclitis, which again comes with red eye. Again, basically, whenever we have an intraocular cause of a red eye, there is ciliary congestion. That means there is congestion around the cornea, and towards the cornices, the congestion goes down. Most patients will have pain, blurred vision. Sometimes there may be history of recurrent redness, and usually we need to do a systemic workup to rule out what are the causes. Similarly, acute congestive glaucoma is a medical emergency where patients come with extremely severe, unbearable pain, vomiting sometimes. There is sudden loss of vision, the eye is extremely red, the cornea looks hazy and lusterless. The pupil may be mid-dilated and the chamber or even on torchlight looks as if it is shallow or flat. So these are again cases which require emergency medication and referral to the ophthalmologist. So these three common conditions, the conjunctivitis comes with red eye, discharge, vision is fine. The iridocyclitis, which comes with mild drop in vision with red eye, and the glaucoma, which comes with severe vision loss, severe pain, vomiting, and a red eye. So sometimes it is very difficult, I would say, even as an ophthalmologist, to find what is happening when I see a patient with a red eye. And I can imagine how tough it is. But I must say that as general physicians, you have a burden of seeing patients many more than us who come with problems, and I think you do a great job in screening and referring them to the right patients to us. Thank you.
Nikhil, that was a very good comprehensive overview on red eye. There are two questions which one is Dr. Roy has asked. COVID patients who has died, can the eyes be donated, or any COVID patient can pledge his eyes? So Nikhil, would you answer?
Yeah, if patient has COVID, then and the death is because of COVID, we are not able to collect the eyes. Eye donation cannot be done. If the patient has COVID and he recovers, he has pledged his eyes, then there is no issue, because basically it's a time limiting condition, and once it settles down, he is like any other normal person. So he can always donate in future whenever required. But as of now, if there is an eye donation which is done, we are mandatorily required to do a COVID test in the dead body to ensure that the person did not die because of COVID, because I think we all know sometimes we don't know what is the cause of death. So we have to rule out COVID before we can use the corneas.
Another question raised is, in red eyes, hot water fermentations or cold water fermentation, what should be done?
Yeah, so this is again very, I would say, a very controversy as far as I am concerned, or we are concerned, because it very often happens that I tell them to do hot water compresses and they tell me the earlier doctor told me to do cold compresses. But as a rule, basically when we see inflammation in the eyelids or inflammatory conditions, we try to tell them to do warm compresses. Whereas when we see, for example, a hematoma, ecchymosis, or when we see something like that, or the patient with allergy who's rubbing the eyes, we tend to do cold compresses. The cold compresses basically numb the corneal nerves, or they numb our nerves and reduce pain, reduce itching. Hot compresses basically increase the blood circulation. So for example, a patient who has a STY or a chalazion or some inflammatory process, it basically accentuates the clearing up mechanisms of the body. But for every condition, I'm sure there will be no one answer, and people may say this is better than the other. So it's a very tricky situation sometimes.
Very true, very true. So we shall move to the next speaker. Dr. Vikram Mehta is a vitreoretinal surgeon and a fellow Retina Foundation from Ahmedabad. He is a very prominent vitreoretinal surgeon and a very reliable vitreoretinal surgeon. I would ask Vikram to speak on diabetic retinopathy. Vikram, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kenya. Thank you for the warm introduction. A very good afternoon to respected seniors and colleagues. Thank you, IMA, for having me here and allowing me to talk on a topic which is very dear to me, which is diabetic retinopathy. Now, diabetic retinopathy can present in different forms, and something as localized to one sector of the retina involved with new vessels, or an early hemorrhage to something as severe as this, where there is complete.
Kenya, the voice sounds to be a little more echoic. The people are complaining. थोड़ा distance से बोलिए.
Is my sound okay?
If you talk from a little distance, it may not have that echo.
Is it still echoing now, sir?
Now okay. Now okay.
Tell me if the sound quality is an issue.
Yeah. Continue.
It could be something as localized as this, to one area of the retina being involved, to an early hemorrhage, to a severe bleeding in the eye causing total loss of vision. And that's why this topic is relevant, because diabetes is the never-ending pandemic. COVID, I believe, is just a temporary showstopper. The burden of this disease is immense, and diabetes does cause blindness, and we all need to accept and believe this fact that diabetic complications of the retina can cause blindness. And what is more important is to know that these blindness causing complications can be prevented if they are detected and treated in time. So one very important take-home message which I would like to give away right now to all primary care physicians and diabetologists and even general ophthalmologists is that to ensure that all your diabetes patients do get a retinopathy screening at least once in a year. Now, in brief, the pathogenesis, it primarily is because of direct long-term consequence of sustained hyperglycemia, which is modified by certain genetic and acquired factors. And one important fact is that after 15 years of diabetes, almost 90% of the patients would have some form of diabetic retinopathy. The two central pathophysiological changes are abnormal vascular permeability and microvascular occlusions, which cause loss of pericytes, basement membrane changes, microaneurysms, rheological changes, retinal ischemia, and complications secondary to neovascularization. Now, coming to the clinical signs that we see in diabetic retinopathy, the most earlier change is called a microaneurysm, which is seen as a red round intraretinal lesion, seen more common on green imaging, more so on fundus fluorescein angiography, and they will be seen only when they are to the size of 30 microns, and at times they can get as large as 125 microns. Next, which we commonly see are intraretinal hemorrhages. They could be dot and blot hemorrhages if they are between the outer plexiform and the inner nuclear layer, or they could be flame shed hemorrhages if they are in the superficial nerve fiber layer. Hard exudates are nothing but a collection of lipid adjacent to microvascular leakages, and these yellow dots are what we call as hard exudates. They appear as creamy yellow plaques, flecks, or dots, and they are often arranged in streaks, clusters, or a circinate. And they have an affinity for the posterior pole, or what we call as the macula. Soft exudates, also known as cotton wool spots, they look like these fluffy white or yellow-white spots marked by striations of the nerve fiber layer, and they indicate some amount of ischemia setting into the retina. Next level of ischemia would lead to IRMA, or intraretinal microvascular abnormalities. As the name suggests, they are intraretinal in location. They never leak on fundus fluorescein angiography, and if the disease worsens, they could convert into neovascularization. Next, the most severe form of complication is neovascularization, which can be at the disc when it is known as an NVD or new vessels on the disc, or it could be seen elsewhere when it is known as an NVE or new vessels elsewhere. These new vessels, if they bleed, they would lead to a hemorrhage, which could be within the jelly or the vitreous, known as vitreous hemorrhage, under the jelly or a subhyaloid hemorrhage, or under the internal limiting membrane, where it will be called as a sub-internal limiting membrane hemorrhage. So whenever you see a cluster of all these clinical signs that I just mentioned, that helps you to stage the disease, which could either be a non-proliferative disease, mild, moderate, severe, or a proliferative disease where you would see new vessels. So just to see the stages, you could have a background diabetic retinopathy, the most benign form of retinopathy, where you would see few scattered microaneurysms, hemorrhages, maybe the occasional hard exudate, and at times retinal edema. If unchecked and if it worsens, it could go to a severe NPDR, also known as pre-PDR or pre-proliferative diabetic retinopathy, where you would have vascular changes, you would have dark clot hemorrhages, cotton wool spots, you would have erymas, but you wouldn't have neovascularization, because when you have neovascularization, you would call it a PDR, and PDR has a very high risk of severe visual loss, and this is characterized by NVD, as I said, new vessels on the disc, NVE, that is new vessels elsewhere. So these vessels are new vessels which would bleed and cause a vitreous hemorrhage like this. And this, if worsens, can lead to fibrovascular traction on the retina, causing a retinal detachment. Diabetic maculopathy is another disease entity in itself, where the changes are limited to the posterior pole, and because of microaneurysms and leakage, there could be macular edema, which could be of the focal variety, a diffuse variety, ischemic variety, or the mixed variety. So coming to the investigations which help us quantitate the disease, the commonest investigations that we do are fluorescein angiography, optical coherence tomography, a non-dye-based angiography, a recent investigative modality which we call as the OCT angiography. And if the media is hazy because of hemorrhage or cataract, we resort to an ultrasonography. So a brief idea about fundus fluorescein angiography. The term might sound real invasive, but it is nothing as invasive as the coronary angiography. Here, a 3 to 5 ml of sodium fluorescein dye, which is non-nephrotoxic, is injected in a peripheral vein, and the retinal circulation is imaged via fundus cameras and special filters. What we diagnose on FFA are leaking microaneurysms, macular perfusion, capillary non-perfusion areas, and neovascularization. We do check the serum creatinine and the eGFR to make sure that it is within the normal range to do an angiography. Optical coherence tomography is a completely non-invasive test where we see the cross-section of the retina. You just need to know that there are 10 layers of the retina. You need not remember the names of each one of them. And diabetic macular edema on OCT can appear in different forms. It could be a spongy thickness on the OCT. It could be a cystoid macular edema where the retina is swollen like this with severe loss of vision. It could be a subfoveal detachment where there is fluid collecting under the retina, again presenting with severe loss of vision. Or there could be something to do at the vitreoretinal interface. So the posterior hyaloid may become thickened and it would start to contract, causing a distortion in vision. This at times can lead to a traction on the retina, which is known as a vitreofoveal traction. And this, if unchecked, can lead to a tractional retinal detachments. Now, all the last three mentioned conditions, taut posterior hyaloid, vitreomacular traction, retinal detachment, would need urgent surgery. So coming to the treatment guidelines, the options that we have are observation, retinal laser photocoagulation, intravitreal injections, and surgery, that is vitrectomy. But what's most important in all of them is systemic control, and that has been very well proven in multiple studies, which we would see later on. So in observation, what we do is we do photographic documentation so that the change over time can be picked up, and at least an annual follow-up is ensured from the patient, or maybe even more frequent if the sugar control is erratic. Coming to systemic control, various studies, one of them being DCCT and the UK PDS, which highlighted the role of a good systemic control to prevent retinopathy progression. And systemic control of not just the diabetes, but also a control of the blood pressure, the nephropathy, lipid profile, anemia, and also we need to be careful about certain drugs such as pioglitazones, which might worsen the macular edema. Smoking is a risk factor and causes rapid retinopathy progression and has to be looked into. Coming to retinal laser, the commonly preferred wavelengths are the green laser or the 532 nanometer wavelength. Yellow laser is also recently being used because it's supposed to be safe for the macula. And rarely red laser, especially during intraoperative endo laser usage. Now this laser could be delivered to the retina via a slit lamp delivery, which is more accurate and delivered through a contact lens, or an indirect laser ophthalmoscope delivery, which has a wider field, can be used even in hazy medias and can be done in supine position. And at times the laser that is done during the surgery is via the endo laser mode of delivery. The laser typically can be a focal laser or a pan-retinal photocoagulation or a PRP laser. Direct focal laser would be applied to the leaking microaneurysms that you've identified on the fundus fluorescein angiography, and this is done to the microaneurysms, edemas, and areas of capillary dropouts. The goal here is to obliterate the leak, and the end point of the laser is whitening that you see here of the microaneurysm. Grid laser is the laser that is applied to a diffusely thickened retina. Care to be taken to be 500 microns away from the fovea and the disc. The aim here is to just tickle the retinal pigment epithelial cells so that the fluid that is collected within the retina can be absorbed. And the aim point here is a light intensity burn. PRP, on the other hand, is used when there is extensive NVD and NVE. The aim here is to convert the hypoxic areas to anoxic areas so that the new vessels can regress. And this in turn goes a long way in preventing recurrent vitreous hemorrhage and other sequelae of neovascularization. Intravitreal injections, the commonly used family of injections are either anti-VEGF or VEGF trap and steroids. Now, this is something which we cannot take lightly. It is done in the operation theater under topical anesthesia, taking all aseptic precautions. The most popular, commonly used ones are the anti-VEGFs or the anti-vascular endothelial growth factors. To name a few, Lucentis eccentrix, Eylea avastins, or now we even have biosimilars which work more or less at the same efficacy and are much economical. Most of them have an initial loading dose of monthly injections for 3 months, and then the subsequent dosage would depend upon the response to the treatment. To highlight here is that intravitreal injections are never a single therapy. It is an ongoing therapy, and the number of injections vary patient to patient. So you might have unhappy patients going back to their primary care physicians saying that I've taken X number of injections, but there's hardly any change which I see. So we need to reassure them that this is the way maculopathy or retinopathy is treated, and you need to be patient to see the response. Just to highlight an example of a diabetic macular edema responding to the injection causing a resolution of the macular edema. Now, why do anti-VEGFs work? Because what has been found out is that there is an upregulation of VEGF in diabetic retinopathy. There is this upregulated VEGF will cause a breakdown of the blood-retinal barrier. This increases vascular permeability, leading to retinal edema and neovascularization. And that's why, apart from treating macular edema, anti-VEGFs are also seen to cause a dramatic response with near complete resolution of the vascular leakage. They give a waiting option to cases of vitreous hemorrhage. Persistent new vessels, despite PRP, respond well to anti-VEGF injections, and they are often used 2 to 5 days prior to vitrectomy to reduce the intraoperative bleeding, and it allows better dissection of the membranes. Intravitreal steroids, they are reserved especially for chronic macular edema cases, or if a cataract surgery is anticipated, or in resistant cases, mainly because of their potential side effects, especially with the older generations, namely triamcinolone acetonide. There were higher incidences of cataract and secondary glaucoma. However, these side effects are much less with the newer dexamethasone implants. Coming to the surgical treatment, in cases where there is non-resolving vitreous hemorrhage, or if there is a traction involving the macula, or if there is a dense premacular hemorrhage, these are the cases where you would want to treat them with surgery or what's known as vitrectomy. Now, just to highlight the way the retinal surgery is performed in today's era, it is a trocar cannula based system, and the gauge of these trocar cannulas are 25 gauge. Now, to make that more understandable, it means 0.5 millimeters. So we have 3 cuts of 0.5 millimeter incisions, and because of them being trocar cannula based system, you almost never need to suture these wounds. And that basically means a faster post-op recovery and better patient comfort. And that's how the eye looks at the end of a retinal surgery. Now, this is what you would do in milder cases of vitreous hemorrhage, where the surgery looks pretty clean and simple. You just need to make the 3 ports. The vitrectomy cutter goes in. Here is the light pipe which shows you the areas which you want to dissect upon. Here we are doing an endocautery or dithermizing a new vessel from where the vitreous hemorrhage had occurred. And after doing that, we would do an endo laser in these skip areas where laser earlier was not possible because of the hemorrhage. And that would be basically the end of the surgery, hardly a 30-minute surgery with a very good patient comfort in the post-operative period. However, in severe stage of the disease, that would mean much more dissection, which means working very, very close to the retina, because these membranes are tightly adhered to the retina and you need to dissect these membranes. Though it can be done safely and we do have good outcomes, but it would mean much more risk, especially when the patient presents in a much more advanced form of the disease. So this is where you are cutting very close to the retina. With the current generation vitrectomy cutters, you can do that without actually damaging or tearing the underlying retina. But these membrane dissections are what is key in this surgery, is finding the right plane. And pre-surgery anti-VEGF injections help in achieving a bloodless field, and you can cut these membranes, literally shave off those membranes from the surface of the retina. And that's how it looks at the end of the surgery. Just a brief mention about cataract and diabetic retinopathy. Diabetes increases the incidence of cataract. Cataract extraction can cause progression of maculopathy. And therefore, we should attempt laser prior to the surgery if the media permits. Else, we should do the cataract surgery under cover of an anti-VEGF injection or steroids. And phaco obviously is the preferred mode of surgery for cataract in patients with diabetes. Coming to the last slide, prevention is the key. Early detection and treatment has to be done to prevent severe late complications. We have to spread the awareness about retinopathy, and we need to tell the patient that all may not be well, even if you are seeing well. And not just the patient, even his relatives, primary care physicians, general ophthalmologists have to be made aware of the need for regular screening for diabetic retinopathy. Annual dilated fundus examination is the minimum that we can do, and prompt referral to a retina specialist in case of maculopathy and retinopathy. Thank you.
Great. So Vikram, that was a very good overview of diabetic retinopathy. And as you said, prevention is better than cure. So all diabetics need to be controlled well before they land up in complicated situations with diabetic retinopathy. So there are no questions related to diabetic retinopathy, but what would you think is the role of Vikram, statins in diabetic retinopathy, or aspirin, tablet aspirin in diabetic retinopathy?
So statins, yeah, especially when we see very exuberant, those yellowish deposits that I showed you, those lipid collections, statins do help in resolution of those hard exudates. The patient may say that I have a very normal lipid profile, but still they do have a role in early resolution of the hard exudates. Aspirin, because of its serological role, does go a long way in preventing neovascular complications. Nothing proven directly, but yeah, it does help in the retinopathy.
Fine. So we move on to the last talk of today's webinar. It's going to be spoken by a pediatric ophthalmologist, Ashni Maniyar, and yeah, Ashni ko phone laga, I think she's not connected. Is Ashni connected?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Okay. Nah, yeah, video. Fine. So Ashni is going to speak about all about child eye care. Over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Hope I am audible and the screen is seen.
Very clear.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, very clear.
Okay. At the outset, thank you, Dr. Vaishal Kenia and IMA to give me an opportunity to share something about child eye care. The way children are just smaller than adults, it's the same thing with their eyes. All the diseases which are seen in adults are also seen in children. So the first and most important thing which is needed for children is a vision screening, and that's the most efficient eye examination which has to be done. This vision screening need not just be done by a pediatric ophthalmologist or an ophthalmologist. It can be done by a pediatrician, a family physician, or any other healthcare provider. Screenings are also offered at schools, at community health centers, and community events. Now, the American Academy of Ophthalmology and the Association of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus, they have recommended a kind of screening depending upon the age of the children. So, for a newborn, the red reflex is the key thing which gives us a clue regarding any other pathology which is there for the child, and the blink and the pupillary response. That's the thing that a pediatrician or a child healthcare provider can do. An ophthalmologist should do a proper comprehensive examination if the baby is born prematurely, if the child has any other signs of eye disease, or has a family history of childhood eye disease. At 6 to 12 months of age, a second screening is surely needed. Here also the red reflex, the pupillary response has to be checked, along with visually inspecting the eyes of the child and checking for any misalignment and the extraocular movements which are there. At 12 to 36 months of age, we need to do a proper detailed eye examination for the children. First, we need to see whether the eye is developing properly or not. Second, and the most foremost thing is to do a photo screening test. Now, this photo screening test is mainly done by different instruments, and it gives us an approximate idea of the refractive error of the child, pointing towards any amblyopia is present or not. So this is how those screeners look like. They give us an idea about the alignment of the eyes, also the refractive errors which are present, along with the astigmatism which is there for the children. The best part about it is, one, it is very handy, and secondly, the test has to be done from quite a distance of 1 meter for the child. Now, at that age, children do not allow us to even go close by. So these instruments help us to guide a lot. The child's vision and eye alignment should be checked at this age. This, as usual, can be done by all health trained people. At 3 to 5 years of age, what happens is the child is not very cooperative, as all of you all know. Secondly, they are not even well aware of the Snellen's charts which we use for adults. So what we have is special Dia symbol charts, which are these charts which have an apple, a square, a house, and a circle, which all kids usually know, or the simple HOVT letters which are there. 99% of the times what problems we face is the child is not willing to speak up. Even if the child knows the alphabet or the picture, is not going to share the details with us. So what we do is we give them cards in their hand and just kind of play a game with them so that they help us out and we can grade the vision which is there. Visual acuity should be tested as soon as the child is old enough to read, as in the 6-6 being the best one. And many children are usually far-sighted, so they have a little bit of a hyperopia which is there, but still children have the capacity to see long distance as well as near with this. Suppose if the child is struggling with the eye chart, then a detailed checkup needs to be done. An ophthalmologist should be doing the screening if for sure the child has any kind of strabismus. If the screening shows that there is any kind of amblyopia or lazy eye, refractive errors like myopia, hypermetropia, or astigmatism is seen. And if the child has a focusing problem, as in if the child's eyes are not stable, they are continuously moving, like nystagmus is present or not. The most important thing is to begin the treatment for these problems as soon as possible. Getting an early treatment for the child is best because they have very few years in hand for us to do the miracles for them to see the lifelong clarity which is needed. For children above 5 years of age, most important thing usually children have is myopia, and of course strabismus needs to be checked. So a regular eye check for all children above 5 years is recommended. Schools also now recommend that a yearly checkup should be done above the age of 5 years. Of course, the way to treat the refractive errors is eyeglasses, and strabismus, or if any other eye problem, if it is present, needs early treatment. Now, there is surely a difference between vision screening and a comprehensive eye examination. So, comprehensive eye examination would diagnose the problem which the child has along with the dilatation which we do for the children. And this gives us a fuller view of the retina also to find out whether there is anything else other than just simple refractive errors which we are dealing with. So which child would need surely a comprehensive eye examination? One who would fail a vision screening. Secondly, if the vision screening is not very conclusive or it cannot be done for children. If the child is for surely referred by a pediatrician or by a school nurse. And if the child himself has a vision complaint or has observed any abnormal visual behavior or is at risk at developing eye problems. Children with medical conditions like Downs, prematurity, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, neurofibromatosis, or children with family history of amblyopia, strabismus, retinoblastoma, any congenital cataracts or glaucoma, these children for sure need a regular 3-monthly checkup by a ophthalmologist. And special children who have learning disabilities or any kind of developmental delays, neuropsychological conditions or behavioral issues should be checked by a ophthalmologist. Sometimes it could just be that a small refractive error is the reason why the child is not learning well in school. The American Association of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus has a special referral criteria for all. So over there, obviously the child, the optometrist, the orthoptist, the school nurse, and all are the ones who are doing the checkup for the children. So they have a specific criteria, as in for newborn to 12 months of age, they do the basic checks, the tests which are there. But they refer infants who do not track well after the 3 months of age. So it is very abnormal for a 3-month-old to not look at a toy or mainly not to follow where the mother is going. So these are the basic things which we check, that if a 3-month-old is not fixing a toy or a light, or if you ask the mother to move away and if the child is not going to look, then there is something abnormal with the infant. Of course, any kind of abnormal red reflex which is there or a history of retinoblastoma in a parent or sibling needs to be referred to an ophthalmologist. From the 12 to 36 months of age, they refer infants with strabismus or infants who have a chronic tearing or discharge which is there, and children who fail the photo screen. From 36 months to 5 years of age, they basically have their visual acuity thresholds. So on the vision charts which are there, the different lines which they are able to read. So suppose if an age of 36 to 47 month baby who cannot manage reading the 20 by 50 line, then that child is referred. Similarly, for the age 48 to 59 years, it would be 20 by 40 line. For children above 5 years of age, it is who cannot see at least 20 by 32. Or if the child is not able to read as the other children in the class are doing, the same grade level people, if they are not able to read, then they have to be referred. Repeat screening is done every 1 to 2 years after 5 years of age, as I told you before. Coming to the premature babies. Now, premature babies is something which all of us are specialized to check as well as specialized to treat with. Now, retinopathy of prematurity is the thing which is the most dreadful for these babies. So there is a criteria which comes according to the gestational age at birth which they have and what is the age at which we do the initial examination. So for example, if it's a 28-weeker baby who is born, so the examination does not need to be done in the 28th or the 29th week. It can be, we can wait till the 32 weeks of the age of the child or 4 weeks after birth. This happens only after the age of 28 weeks. But if the child is born before that, a earlier examination in 2 to 3 weeks is also advisable. Timely screening can prevent blindness in these children. As we all know that ROP is the potentially blinding eye disorder that affects premature infants. The risk factors for ROP go mainly are prematurity, low birth weight, high exposure to oxygen for a prolonged period, sepsis, anemia, cardiac defects, multiple blood transfusions, and respiratory distress syndromes. Now the main question comes is whom to screen. Screening should be done for infants with either less than 2000 gram birth weight, or if their gestational age is below 35 weeks, or if they've had a unstable clinical course and NICU stay. Second most commonest thing, as I told you, is when to screen. So usually the first screening is done by 4 weeks of birth, but those with lesser age, lesser gestational age and lesser birth weight, less than 1250 grams, should be screened earlier also. It's not that ROP screening is done and there is no treatment to it. For sure, treatment is there. There are anti-VEGFs which are given to these babies, and of course, laser therapy, which is the gold standard. So there is a proper algorithm for the management of ROP which we have. Once we come to know that this premature baby is at high risk, the screening is the first screening. Once it is done, we obviously stage the ROP, and the zoning zones and the staging of the ROP is done, and on that basis the follow-up is decided. So for example, if the baby has a stage 1 or stage 2 of ROP in zone 1, then maybe the follow-up would be 1 week, or a regressing ROP or just an immature vascularization which is there, then the follow-up would be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. So it is not mandatory that all the babies would have a weekly follow-up, nor is it mandatory that everyone would have like a 3-week checkup. And of course, if there is aggressive ROP or ROP with plus disease, so basically those are the visual threatening ROPs which are there. They require ablative laser therapy, and their follow-ups are much less than what it would be for the other babies. Stage 4 or stage 5 ROP is mainly the retinal detachment kind of diseases, and they require the vitreoretinal surgery care as soon as possible. Now, a preterm infant, suppose doesn't have any ROP, then there are still chances that the child would have ocular complications like myopia and strabismus once they grow up, or it would be that they would be like any other normal child and have no visual impairment or any other complications. But since there are chances that these premature babies have ocular complications, a regular checkup from an ophthalmologist is needed for them also. Now, a premature infant who has ROP but does not need any treatment, is just regularly followed up and does not need any VEGF or no laser therapy, that child could have anything from a normal eye to ocular complications like myopia or cortical visual impairments, visual perception problems, or long-term complications of ROP like retinal detachment. They're exactly the same set of things which happen to a child who's been treated for ROP. Coming to specific things for children, blur vision being the commonest complaint which many children have of these days. So I had a child who was 7-year-old and who had a fan complaint of blurred vision from the last bench of school. Mother would come up saying that no, she was incomplete in her schoolwork and spelling mistakes, the standard complaints which mothers have for their children. No other systemic illness, but on examination she was found to have a refractive error. So glasses was given to her and she was as usual asked for a regular follow-up. Now the same girl comes when she's 8-year-old. Girl is still saying that I have difficulty sometimes in vision, but the mother says that no, she's just lying since she's wearing her glasses full time. She feels that she's just making up stories for it. But when we do her checkup, we realize that her refractive error has stepped up. And it's not stepped up by just a 0.2 or a 0.5%. It is more than that. It is nearly 1.25 diopters of step up, which is there. So the first and foremost thing what we do is we give the child a new glass prescription. Now, with the availability of atropine sulfate 0.01%, this is a very good drop which is there, which helps in controlling the growth of the eyeball, and it helps in controlling the simple myopia which is happening in children. So earlier when there was no medicine like this, the child's refractive error would jump up quite a lot. But now with the invention of these drops, it's much better, and the growth of the eyeball is limited. So obviously the refractive error change is also well under control. Surely the child is asked to do an outdoor activity for 1 hour and reduce the screen time as much as possible. So this atropine 0.01% eye drops, this is basically given to children from 5 to 14 years of age. For children who have their refractive errors who's progressing by more than 0.5 diopters per year. And prior to starting these drops, what we do is a basic cycloplegic refraction and an Agilent measurement, which is done by all ophthalmologists. Periodic follow-ups with this treatment is needed, anywhere from 3 to 4 months, just to see the evaluation, just to evaluate regularly whether the drop is having any effect on the child or not. And atropine usually is used in the concentration of 1% by the ophthalmologist for all our uveitis cases, but this is just a 0.01% concentration, very low dose concentration drug, which is helpful. Of course, it does have its few side effects like allergy, blurry vision for near, photophobia, and headache, but it's observed in very, very, very few patients. And the group of pediatric ophthalmologists still suggest that it has to be used only for simple myopia. There are no short studies which are done that whether it is effective in other kinds of myopia or not. But yeah, this drug is giving us a hope that the refractive errors of children would not go skyrocketing like before. Red eye, as described by Dr. Gokhale before, is the thing which is seen in children also. So there was a 5-year-old boy who came with this classical complaint of itching, watering, and foreign body sensation. Lid eversion, it shows a frank papillae. So just to curb down this, the severe symptoms of the child, we start him on an antibiotic steroid eye drops just for a short 1 week's time, and we switch over to a mast cell stabilizer. Ice fermentation is surely helpful for the child. One, it relaxes the eye. Secondly, the urge to itch comes down much less. So it is very good because once the child stops itching, automatically the medicines also have their good effect, and the results are as what we expect. We have to explain to the parents and the child that the child does not have to do eye rubbing. It is a little difficult explaining to them, but yeah, you need to just explain it to them as just as a big science project is explained to them, and they do understand the whole concept very nicely. There was another boy who had complaints of redness and frank discharge. So this child had more of a bacterial conjunctivitis and was given antibiotic drops. Of course, no steroids for the child. Antibiotic eye ointment at night. Was asked to take proper eye care and no water splashing. Another boy who had complaint of redness, foreign body sensation, watering, but the child also was complaining a little bit pain near the ear, and mild fever was seen. On eversion, we could see this kind of a membrane which was there. And it was a viral conjunctivitis for which the treatment was given, mainstay being the lubricating eye drops, and any kind of fever or any systemic illness was asked to be treated. Another boy was playing and suddenly started getting this poking sensation, redness and watering, and on lid eversion we see a foreign body. So for children also, as for adults, they have their different infective and non-infective causes for the redness. Allergic conjunctivitis being very common in children, bacterial viral conjunctivitis following suit. Blepharitis is also seen commonly in children. Keratitis, iritis is much less as compared to the others. And non-infective causes like foreign body, trauma, subconjunctival hemorrhage, and corneal abrasions are seen. Commonest problems with trauma which they have is pencil poking during their school hours or hand injury when playing with their friends, stuff like that. Watery eyes. Now a newborn's mother comes to me saying that my newborn's only the right eye is watering and they have this frank crusting and the child's eye doesn't open very comfortably in the morning. What needs to be done? So we do the check that the child is fixing light very nicely, but on pressure over the lacrimal sac area, there is frank discharge which comes out. This gives us an indication that the child has congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction. Surgery is not the first mainstay which is there. The most important thing what needs to be done for these children is a regular crigler massage. So this massaging is basically done in the lacrimal sac area, with strokes being from the upper part of the eye to lower down. Secondly, just to control the infection, antibiotic drops like tobramycin or simple chloramphenicol are given. No high dose antibiotics are needed for them. No systemic antibiotics are needed for them. Mother is asked to press on the sac area 1 or 2 in a day after washing the hands properly, so that whatever discharge is collecting inside the lacrimal sac area can come out. Obviously, cleaning needs to be done with sterile cotton. A regular follow-up is asked for these children. Probing is done if this massaging does not help them at 6 to 8 months of age. Still, if the child complains of watering and discharge, a repeat probing is also done for them. Suppose if after doing all these modalities, nothing is working out, then a diaphragm or rhinostomy is what we advise for the children. Similarly, a 2-month-old girl, the mother says that she has watering, but she has a whitish looking cornea. The eyes appear bigger to the mother than what it was when she was born. When the child comes, the moment you shine torch at the baby starts crying. It's like an indication that the child has photophobia, is not able to tolerate the light. And of course, we need to take up the child because a 2-month-old baby is not going to allow us do all the tests which we need to do. So we take up the child for an examination under anesthesia. We check the corneal diameters is increased. The intraocular pressure is also way above normal. We diagnose the child with a congenital glaucoma. Here, the mainstay is not medicines. Surgery is the thing with what a child would need. So both eyes trabeculectomy under general anesthesia is done for the baby. Most important thing for these babies is the regular follow-up is needed. Maybe a repeat trabeculotomy would be needed. Other glaucoma valve surgeries would be needed for the baby. Everything to do for the vision of the child. White reflex. It's like a spot diagnosis for all of us and all of y'all, but the mother notices it only after 2 years of age that the child's eye has this white reflex, and the child is unable to see things. She's not playing well, so she comes up to us and we see that the child is not even fixing light. She doesn't have a steady eye, nor is her vision maintained. The child has nystagmus. She has a squint in the form of an esotropia and cataract, as we see in both the eyes. For all cataracts, the treatment is surgery. Same thing goes for the baby also. But the difference comes that whether we need to put an intraocular lens for the child or not. That is upon the age of the child. And at all ages, we have these special intraocular lens calculations which need to be done. We need to purposefully undercorrect the lenses so that as the child grows, as the eyes are going to grow, the child may or may not need another surgery for the lens replacement. So calculations are done on that basis, and then an intraocular lens is implanted for these children. Of course, it's not like an adult cataract. We need to do a posterior curvilinear capsular excess for them and do a anterior vitrectomy for them so that we don't get an early opacification and not a resurgery, which can be done easily for these children. Regular follow-up is needed for these children. If we are leaving the children a fake cake as in without any lens, then we need to give them contact lenses or glasses, whatever the child is comfortable with. Later on, a secondary lens implantation is usually mandatory for all these children. We do need to give them bifocal glasses also if needed. And yeah, regular follow-up in the terms of their intraocular pressures, any other complications, any squinting which is happening is the main thing which is needed for these children. Just as before, which I highlighted on the retinopathy of prematurity, there was a premature baby who was born at 32 weeks, was just marginally 1.6 kilogram birth weight, had a eventful NICU stay. The only problem was that they came from the interiors and they did not have a proper ROP screening done for the child. The mother noticed a white reflex at 5 months of age, and that's when she came, and that's what we realized, that the child already has retinal detachment and a surgical intervention was needed for the child. Here is a child who is a 2.5-year-old girl. The father gave a frank history of retinoblastoma. The mother notices a white reflex and gets the child immediately to us. And of course, further treatment in the care of retinoblastoma was given at the higher center to the child. Coming to the differentials for the white pupillary reflex, it varies anywhere from a simple corneal opacity to a cataract to congenital abnormalities like a persistent hypoplastic primary vitreous or a congenital retinal detachment, any kind of infection, inflammations which are there, neoplasia like retinoblastoma, and traumatic vitreous hemorrhage or retinal detachment which are there. Post disease is also one condition which gives you a white reflex. So all these conditions basically require ophthalmologist care and further treatment for the children. Now the child is not going to complain for any of it, but the caretaker has to be a little alert for it. And of course, the general physicians and the pediatricians are the main people who are going to help the children out. Coming to deviating eyes, strabismus is very clearly seen for many of the children. So a 3-year-old coming with the deviation of the eyes, the child is immediately referred and the squint evaluation is done. She has a frank esotropia, which you can see. Refractive error, which was there, was given to the child and a surgery was done to align the eyes. So here is a child whose esotropia or the squinting is very clearly seen. But there are other set of squints and the extraocular muscle involvement, certain diseases which are not picked up just by torchlight examination. So when a regular checkup is done for the child, that's when an ophthalmologist can pick up that these kind of squints are there and that needs to be treated. Even if there is just laziness of one eye, it's going to be picked up only when the vision check is done, and usually these children do come up with strabismus at a later age. Here is a child known case of Down syndrome. As a routine, since all the syndromic babies are checked, she was also checked. She had a myopic refractive error. Initially when we checked her, she just had a vision of 6/12, but with glasses and proper patching treatment which was done for her, she improved to 6/6 in a few months. Here is a baby with albinism. He had very high power glasses. He had nystagmus and squint. So we need to take special care for these children in the form of giving them refractive errors, giving them those photochromatic glasses which are going to help them and protect them when they're doing their outside activities. Also, a few regular care for the squint and nystagmus is done for them. As all syndromes are associated with multiple organ involvement, eyes and the syndromes also have quite a lot of correlation. So musculoskeletal diseases like myasthenia gravis have ocular involvements. Metabolic diseases like albinism, homocystinuria, all mucopolysaccharidosis, Niemann-Pick disease, Wilson's disease, all these diseases have their ocular involvements which need to be checked. A baby with a mucopolysaccharidosis can be diagnosed with it by simple just the corneal involvement which can be seen. There are other skin and mucous membrane disorders also which are present which need an ophthalmic referral to find out whether they have any other ocular problems associated with it. Chromosomal and genetic disorders, as eye care comes as a part of their routine screening, so they are usually picked up faster. The most important question comes to us is when to consult an eye specialist. So if you see a child with a squint, or if you suspect that the child is having any complaints of blur vision, or the mother is saying of any blur vision, or if you see a baby with glasses or has a lot of screen time, some child who is voluntarily not very attentive in school, is having headaches, always complains of eye pain, runs away from light, could have some underlying pathology for which a comprehensive eye checkup is needed from an ophthalmologist for the child. Red eye and a wide reflex is always well known and needs to be taken proper care of. The commonest question which all parents would ask to us or to general practitioners is when to get my child's eye checked for the first time. So what we as pediatric ophthalmologists say, as any child who is less than 1 year of age, or at the age of 3 and at the age of 5. Children should be checked at this age by an ophthalmologist so that whatever condition, whatever eye problem that the child would be having would be picked up faster and care would be taken at a younger age so that the vision would always remain good and the future of the child would always be more bright. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashni. That was a very detailed overview of pediatric eye care. I'm sure it would have
Thank
benefited.
you so much.
Sorry?
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, okay. Fine. Sir, over to you, Akhil sir.
Yeah, any questions I think somebody wants to ask to any of the speakers? Gajaria, want to ask something?
Questions in the chat box.
So yes, you can. They are there?
Gajaria doesn't seem to be there.
Ajay. Any question in the chat box?
Sir, there
How
are
much?
I just wanted to ask you one question, that whether pediatricians refer you cases or general practice, because probably we nowadays the children are only going to pediatricians.
So what happens is we do get referrals from pediatricians as well as general practitioners. But since now majority of the children refer to the pediatricians, we get a direct call from the pediatricians themselves. Also, the schools and all have their certain set of in-house
Yeah.
pediatricians come in. So that's a better referral which we get.
But
So what I wanted to ask was that all children regularly should have an eye checkup at what age?
So as I
No problem, just regular checkup.
Hello.